Hello students, this is Borana Africa 2 and today we start the law of contract 1. Students, for your information, the law of contracts do have two parts, which are the law of contract 1 and the law of contract 2. And the students, in our today's class, we will start discussion on the law of contract 1, which consists of 4 basic and important chapters. So, the first chapter is all about obligations in general. And under this chapter, we'll see the definitions, concepts, nature, types, and blah blah of obligations. And the second chapter is all about the formation of contracts, how valid and legally acceptable contracts form, and what elements needs to be fulfilled in forming and concluding the basic contracts, the valid contracts. So students, the third chapter is all about effects of contracts. That means what effects can validly formed contract produce. And the fourth chapter is all about non-performance as one effect of contracts and its remedies. And today students will begin the first chapter, which is obligations in general. And in this chapter, we will see the concept of obligations, definitions of the concept of obligation will be discussed here, students, and the definitions of obligations. What are the definition of obligations, and also the source of obligation, the source of obligations. So, source of obligations.
Oh.
Types of obligations, and the meaning of contracts. The meaning of contracts, contract law, and the purpose and the scope of contract law, purpose of contract law, and other important matters will be discussed under this chapter. So students, now let's start our discussion on the first chapter. Before that, students, let me tell you one thing. As you know, the 1916 Ethiopian Civil Code, consists of 3,367 articles, provisions, authorities. Those 3,367 articles are divided into 5 books and 22 titles. So students, the first book talks about persons. The first book is all about persons, and the second book is family and successions, related with family and succession, and the third book is all about goods, which are property law and other. And the fourth chapter, the fourth book is all about obligations in general. Obligations. So our discussion is really focused on this. And the fifth book is all about special contract. These are how our 1916 Ethiopian Civil Code classify and divide those provisions into different 5 basic books. So now students, let's begin by defining the term obligation. Obligation. So what is obligation? What does it mean by obligation? First, we are required to understand what does it mean by obligation. What does it mean by obligation? Understand, we should understand what is obligations. So students, here there is no single and a universally acceptable definition of obligations in general. We don't have. We don't have one single, common, universally acceptable and agreed definition of obligation. But we can find different definitions given by different individuals and also Black's Law Dictionary and also different laws indirectly. So students, for example, though there is no single definitions, the Roman, Latin and the Roman lawyers defines these obligations as an undertaking or legally binding relationship with respect to when one party promises the other party to perform some acts or to do something or to deliver something. So these Roman lawyers define these obligations as an undertaking, an agreement. They define it as an undertaking, an agreement, or legally binding relationship between two or more persons. It requires two or more parties say, because it said that with respect to when one party promises the other parties. This means from this you can understand that there are two or more parties, right? So one of the parties agree to perform something, agree to deliver something, agree to do something. So these are the definitions given for obligations by Latin and Roman lawyers. And also the other definition is given by Roman jurists, the Roman jurist guys. So this jurist defines obligation as wrote obligation means a personal obligation means a personal claim brought against another. So students, this Roman jurist called Guy said that obligation means a personal claim brought against another in order to force him before us to give us or to do something, to give us, that means to deliver or to do something for us or to render rights to us so as we are able to exercise our rights. So this is the definitions provided by Roman jurist called Guy. So according to him, obligation means a personal claim brought against another person by another individual. Why? Because in order to force him to give us, to do something for us, or to render right to us. So these are the second definitions. Kanaafuu hiikaan siingilii ta'e fi addunyaa irratti walii galame tokko hin jiru jechuudha obligationidha. Haa ta'u iyyuu malee hiikkaawwan adda addaa provide ta'anii jiru. Fakkeenyaaf looyeroonni warra Laatiniif Roomaan akkam jedhanii define godhu undertakingidha yookaan immoo waliigalteedha. Seeraan dirqisiisaa kan ta'e, hariiroo seeraan dirqisiisaa kan ta'e, paartii lamaaf ta'u kan qabuu fi inni tokko isa tokkoof waan ta'e raawwachuudhaaf, kennuudhaaf yookaan immoo raawwachuu dhiisuuf kan itti waadaa seenuudha jedhanii define godhu jechuudha. So ምንም እንኳን ሲንግል ዲፊኒሽን ባይኖርም ላቲን እና ሮማን ሎየርስ እንዴት ዲፋይን አድርጉታል ማለት ነው? አስ አን አንደርቴኪንግ ይሉታል። ግንኙነት የህግ አስገዳጅነት ያለው ግንኙነት ስምምነት ሲሆን ከሁለትና ከዛ በላይ ፓርቲ የያዘ በዛ ጊዜ አንዱ ፓርቲ ለሆነ ፓርቲ ወይም ደግሞ ለሆነ ግለሰብ የሆነ ነገር ለማድረግ ወይ ላለማድረግ ወይ ደግሞ ለመስጠት ሲስማሙ ማለት ነው። ሶ ይሄ ያ ግዴታ ነው ማለት ነው። ሶ ፕሮሚስስ ይሉታል። ሮማን ጁሪስት የሚባል ጋይ ደግሞ ማልጀሌ ዲፋይን ጎዳ ፐርሰናል ክሌም ይላል። Gaaffii namni tokko nama biraarraa akka waan tokko kennuuf, akka waan ta'e raawwatuuf kan gaafannu jechuudha. So the personal claim ሌላ ሰው የሆነ ነገር እንዲያደርግልን እንዲሰጠን የምንጠይቀው ነው ብሎ ጋይም ዲፋይን ያደርጋል ማለት ነው። Then the other definitions is also provided when we see article 1101 of French Civil Code. French Civil Code define it in the aspect of contract in general. That means this French Civil Code did not provide a direct definitions for this obligation. The term obligation. Rather, it provides indirect definitions in defining where to define contracts under Article 1101. So, this French Civil Code under Article 1101 provides definitions for contracts, and that the judges define contract as what? Contract and agreement. An agreement to establish vary exclusive rights and obligations of parties here. So here it is defining not obligation, rather it is defining a contract. But in defining a contract, there can be indirect definitions for obligations here. So from these definitions, judges define obligation as a legally binding relation here, as we have seen above. Judges define obligation as a legally binding relations when one party in relation to another party is obliged to give, to do, not to do something. So similar with the above definitions. So students, these are the definitions that come in direct definitions from Article 1101 of the French Civil Code. So obligations can be understood in this way as a legally binding relations when one party in relation to another party is obliged to give or to do. Here to give, maybe to give, to deliver something, to do or not to do. kennuuf ta'uu danda'a, waan ta'e raawwachuudhaaf yookaan raawwachuu dhiisuudhaaf kan dirqamu jechuudha የሚገደድበት ወይ ለመስጠት ሊሆን ይችላል ወይ ለማድረግ ሊሆን ይችላል ወይ ደግሞ ላለማድረግ ሊሆን ይችላል ማለት ነው። So students, not only this, here there is also definition provided by Black's Law Dictionary which define law terminology, and also definition for obligation also provided here. So this Black's Law Dictionary defines obligations as a legal duty or moral duty to do or not to do something. Short, clear and precise definitions provided under Black's Law Dictionary. So Black's Law Dictionary define obligation as a legal duty or it may be moral duty to do or not to do something. ከላፉ ይሄ የህግ ግዴታ ወይም ደግሞ ሞራላዊ ግዴታ የሆነ ነገር ለማድረግ ወይም ላለማድረግ አፉ ድጋፍተውማ ሴራ ድርቀማ ሴራ yookaan dirqama yaada dirqama moraali so wanta raawwachuudha yookaan immoo raawwachuudha sabade define godhachuudha. Then the definitions of obligations establish the here unilateral act of the debtor either to give, to do, not to do as patrimonial obligation. It means that the debtor has obligation while the creditor has the rights. So in this case, from these definitions, what we understood is we do have two or more parties. One is the bearer of rights and the other one is the bearer of duties. That are debtors and creditors, in which debtor, the duty bearer, is obliged to give something or to do something or not to do something. Students, the same is true. The same is true in or under our country's civil code. The same is true under the Ethiopian civil code. So our country's civil code is not an exception. That means though, as we have seen above, though the fourth book is titled as obligations, there is no direct definitions, nowhere direct definitions for obligation is provided under Ethiopian civil code. Nowhere defined. Nowhere defined. So the fourth book titled as obligation. However, like that of Article 1101 of the French Civil Code, we can understand obligations, or our country's civil code also provide the definition for obligations indirectly in defining some contract under Article 1675. They define contract as a contract is an agreement whereby two or more persons, as between themselves, create, vary, extinguish obligation of proprietary nature. ስለዚህ ኮንትራክት jechuun agreementii yookaan waliigaltee namni lamaaf isaa ol here we can see the elements we will discuss when we see contract. So a contract is an agreement whereby two or more persons as between themselves create, vary, extinguish obligation of proprietary nature. So here basically under the civil code, obligation is the object of the contract. So object of the contract. So there is no direct definition provided in our country's civil code. However, there is, like that of the French civil code, we do have an indirect definition provided for obligations under 1675. So obligation, it can be to give, obligation can be to do, or obligation can be not to do. We can understand this from Article 1712. So as its mother source did. So our country civil code also defines obligation in the aspect of contract as its mother source did. Who is the mother source? The French civil code, because we borrow many laws from French. So these are generally some concepts that we can understood from the definitions given for obligations by different laws and persons. So in general, students, there is no single and universally acceptable definition of obligations. No single and universally acceptable definition of obligations. In our today's class, the other point that we will discuss is that of natures of obligations. The nature of obligations. So, from the definitions of obligation given above, we can pinpoint the following essential defining elements of an obligation. So one can mouthfully speak about the existence of obligations. Students, from the definition we provided above, we do have, or we can find, the following basic and important elements. The first one is there is an active subject, the involvement of an active subject. Who is an active subject? Is the one who has the power to demand the presentation, who is known as or called creditor. Kanaafuu definition amma gubbaatti define goone waa'ee obligation irraati maal hubachuu dandeenya jechuudha. Nature obligation ilaaluu dandeenya. Kana keessatti maal ilaaluu dandeenya? Elementiiwwan obligation gaaf jenne egaa legally binding relation jenneerra. Sana keessatti namni tokko promise godha maal gochuudhaaf, waan ta'e raawwachuudhaaf to do, raawwachuu dhiisuudhaaf not to do, kennuudhaaf to give jenneerra. Sana keessatti egaa elementiiwwan gaafa obligation define goone elementiiwwan jiran maal fakkaatu? ምን አይነት ኤሌመንቶች በኦብሊጌሽን ዲፊኒሽን ውስጥ ተካተዋል የሚሉትን እና የመጀመሪያው አክቲቭ ሳብጀክት ነው። አክቲቭ ሳብጀክት ማለት ደግሞ የመብት ባለቤት አባ መርጋ ክሬዲተር that is the bearer of rights Secondly, we do have passive subject here, who is bound to perform the presentation known as the debtor. ደግሞ ግዴታ ነው ያለበት ግለሰብ ማለት ነው። that means we do have duty bearer and we do have right holder here. So the duty bearer fulfills responsibility towards the right holder, and then the right holder claims right from the duty bearer ማለት ነው። duty bearer ናፉ qaama lamatu jira. inni tokko abbaa dirqamaa, inni tokko immoo abbaa mirgaa. Abbaan dirqamaa maal gochuu qaba jechuudha? Itti gaafatamummaa isatti kenname abbaa mirgaa sanaaf raawwata. Abbaan mirgaa sun immoo mirga qabu sana abbaa dirqamaa sanarraa gaafatee raawwachiifata jechuudha. Kana keessatti waan maal argaa jechuudha? ስለ ግዴታ ያየን ነው ማለት ነው። ሁለት ፓርቶች መኖሩ ዲዩቲ ቢረር እና ራይት ሆልደር፣ ባለመብትና ባለ ግዴታ። የግዴታ ባለቤት የመብት ባለቤት፣ የግዴታ ባለቤት ያለበትን ግዴታ ለመብት ባለቤቱ ማሟላት፣ የመብት ባለቤቱ ደግሞ ያለውን መብት ከግዴታ ባለቤት መጠየቅ። so these are the natures of obligations. Some elements active subject, passive subject, and thirdly we do have objects. That means giving something, maybe doing something, maybe not doing something. They are the object of that contract. And fourthly, we can find the juridical tie between the two subjects, by reason of which the debtor is bound in favor of the creditor to perform the presentation ማለት ነው። ያንን አስገዳጅነትን የምትፈጥር ትስስር አለች ማለት ነው። የጁሪዲካል ታይ ስንል between two subjects, that means two subjects means active subject and passive subject, debtor and creditor. So between these two subjects we do have what? We do have a juridical tie, by reason of which the debtor bound in favor of the creditor to perform the presentation ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ የምታሳሰራቸው ዴተሩ የሆነ ነገር እንዲፈጽም የምታደርግ ግዴታ የምትፈጽም ትስስር አለ ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ እነዚህን ነገሮች ኤሌመንቶች የምንፈልገው ከየት ነው ማለት ነው? ከኦብሊጌሽን ዲፊኒሽን ነው ማለት ነው። so here let's see an example to understand obligation, active subject and a passive subject here. For example, there is a person called John. John enters into a contract of sale with Charles, who paid the purchase of a car. That means there is a contract of sale, buying and selling. John is the buyer, and John is the seller and Charles is the buyer. Then Charles already paid the amount of the car. However, John did not deliver the car as they agreed. In this case, John is the passive subject or the debtor, because he did not fulfill his obligation yet. That means he did not deliver the car to Charles, but Charles paid the amount first. So Charles is the active subject or creditor, and John is the passive subject or debtors. The object or presentation is the car, the object, and the obligation to deliver is a legal tie. This obligation, we have seen that obligation can be obligation to do, obligation can be obligation to deliver, obligation can be obligation to not to do. But here in contract of sale we have obligation to deliver things. So John agreed to deliver, to sell car to Charles, and Charles fulfilled his duty. But if John failed to deliver the car, John is the debtor, Charles is the creditor or the bearer of the right, and the object is on which they agreed is a car, and the obligation to deliver is a juridical tie, the legal tie which binds them. ስለዚህ ይህንን እንደዚህ መረዳት አለብን ማለት ነው። ሆነ ክርስቲያን this is also known as unilateral obligation, that is obligation of the debtor to fulfill, to comply his commitment, in this case the delivery of the car ማለት ነው። on the other hand if John delivered the car and Charles did not pay, then Charles becomes the debtor who is bound to pay, while John is the creditor who has the right to demand the presentation. Demand the presentation ማለት ነው። ይሄን ደግሞ ገልብጠን እንየው። በነገራችን ደግሞ ይላል for example John already delivered the car as agreed, but Charles did not pay or failed to make a payment as they agreed. In this circumstance, Charles becomes the debtor or the duty bearer, and then John becomes the creditor, the bearer of rights. So he has the right to demand the presentation. This is an example to understand active subject, passive subject, juridical tie, and an object or presentation in case of some elements in defining the term obligation. Obligations. Students, the other basic and important topic of this chapter is source of obligation. From where obligation emanates. Madda dirqamoota. Dirqamni eessaa madda? Giddeeraa keetii manachaa. Students, obligation can arise from law. First, obligation can arise from the law. First, obligation can arise from the law as the first place, can arise from the contract, and the quasi-contracts. So, in the next class, we will see this source of obligation.